Today, in episode 154 of the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, we speak to strategy expert Sean Ryan, and he's going to tell you how you can get your business strategy aligned in just 7 simple steps. That's right, folks. It's all about business strategy today. Are you ready for this? All right, let's do it. Welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. This is your host, Scott McCarthy, and welcome to the weekly podcast where we focus on the 3 domains of leadership. Leading yourself so that you can be the best leader possible. Leading your team so you can build those high-performing teams. And leading your organization so you can drive that organizational output through the roof. Here at this show, we go and speak to world-leading leadership experts across those 3 domains and unlock their secrets, their tips, their tricks, and everything else in between, while coupling it with my 20 years of military experience as a senior Army officer in the Canadian Armed Forces to bring you the most complete leadership podcast going. You can find out more, everything Moving Forward Leadership at movingforwardleadership.com. Now, let's get to the show. Yes, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here for yet another outstanding episode lined up here at Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. We're going to be looking at business strategy today, and reality is no matter what type of organization you lead, you need to worry about strategy. Why? Because it's one of the things that's going to drive you and drive your organization towards your goals for the future. A poor aligned strategy equals failure. Absolute failure. So don't fail. Make sure you lead and succeed at leading. But before we get into the show and Sean, I just got one quick announcement. And that is I'm running a survey right now. And I want to know how this show can get better for you. But there's only one way for me to find out. And that is if you tell me. So go to movingforwardleadership.com/survey. Just take 2 minutes and quickly fill out that survey for me. It will help me immensely. You have no idea. It's like gold. And I want to say thank you. So for all those who filled the survey, I am going to select one person and they're going to get an opportunity to get a free book from the Moving Forward Leadership resources page. All expenses paid by me, shipped to your door. But again, you got to fill out the survey to get that. So check it out, movingforwardleadership.com/survey. The link's in the show notes. I'm here for you. Can you be here for me and just do this one little thing? Seriously, it will just take 2 minutes of your time. All right, so let's dive into today's topic and more importantly, the guest who's going to be talking about the topic at hand. Sean Ryan's a world-renowned business consultant. He has literally worked with businesses all around the world like Disney, FedEx, Nestle Waters, and North America Perrier Group. So just to give you an idea, he's got more than 2 decades of industry experience, and he's also basically world known as a transformational change agent. He believes in his 7 gears of execution, which drives organizations' strategy and make sure that they're aligned so that you get the results that you're looking for. Too many businesses and too many organizations out there have poor aligned strategy, which in turn allows the business to unfortunately go in all kinds of different directions. Does that sound familiar? It probably does. We've all been in those companies and those organizations where the strategy and the tactics at the ground level just weren't lined up and you can feel it. You know, you felt like you were spinning your tires at 10,000 RPMs, but you were going nowhere. So let's find out how we can fix that, shall we? All right, ladies and gentlemen, you sit back, relax, and listen to my podcast about how you can get your business strategy in gear with Sean Ryan. Sean, welcome to the podcast, man. It's so great to have you here today.
Scott, thanks a bunch. Looking forward to it.
Now, we're just having a good chat there before I hit record. Got a copy of the book here. Excited to talk to not only a fellow Canadian, a fellow East Coaster. I don't get many people from Canada, let alone the East Coast, on the show. So it's always good to have another one here.
Glad to be here. We'll, try to do Canada proud here today.
We will. So listen, I got to know, the first thing in the back of my mind is why this book, what was the inspiration, and the thing that drove you to, I guess, get in gear to write a book about strategy, execution, organization, organizational behavior, culture, and those things.
It's kind of a torturous road, but simply, we had a lot of clients that were really struggling getting the results from their strategy that they wanted. And I thought it was just my experience over 30 years of consulting. I kept running into organizations that weren't performing the way they wanted to. And we began to outline the things that we had to do for them to help them be successful and achieve better results than they were getting. And then very specifically in about 2012, a client came to me, and it was an organization that had a pretty good strategy. They had thought through things well, but they weren't getting the results. And he said, Sean, help us figure this out. And so that was the point at which I took a lot of the things that we'd been doing over the years and put them into the beginning of the construct that led to the book, Get in Gear. And at that point, we identified 4 of the 7 gears that we outlined in the book, the ones that really talk about individuals and teams performing the best they possibly can, taking the strategy, translating it into the goals that they have, and then generating individual and team results that align to the strategy. And then a little bit later, I'd always thought I was going to write a book. I thought I've had thoughts in my head about several books. I never thought Getting Gear was going to be the first book. Thought that a book just specifically around leadership was going to be the first book. But then I got ready to start writing, and it struck me, man, we're getting a lot of success with the things that we're doing around the concepts that got embedded in Getting Gear. And so then it began to accumulate into, hey, I'm gonna write a book, and it's going to be around driving strategy to results, not just specifically leadership. And then, boom, the book was born.
That's cool. That's neat. It's pretty common, actually, of all the authors. Very similar. People are like, oh, I wasn't planning on writing it, but it kind of just happened because this is what I've been working on for months upon years. It's interesting, though. You say that you were looking at writing a book specifically on leadership. I find all these things part of leadership. And the podcast here is very comprehensive in that we have a wide range, because I talk about 3 domains of leadership. First one being leading yourself. So how do you as a leader become better? How do you operate at your peak performance? How do you, take care of yourself physically, mentally, all those things? Next thing is leading your team. So how do you take care of Jill, Joe, John? How do you build that high performing team, collaborative workspace? And then finally is leading your organization, which is exactly what we're talking about here in organizational culture, optimization, strategy, all those different things. So of my 3 domains, we're talking about the third one, but of course that always impacts the other 3, because if your organization isn't successful, if your business is not successful, then you can't take care of your people as well. You can't give them the benefits that you want to give them. You can't, you can't raise their salaries as quick. You can't do all this stuff. You lose people. So your team aspect starts failing. And then once all that happens, you start getting stressed out as a leader than yourself. Then there's issues that pop up with yourself. So I think a lot of people discount this aspect in leadership and its importance, because it really is. And being able to lead your organization and push it forward has an impact, and it is part of leadership to me. So it's great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And actually, as I was looking at your website and some of the things that you've done, and you talk about your 3 domains of leadership, it actually overlays perfectly. It's almost like you and I were drinking from the same cup of tea or the same pot of tea, because that's exactly how we think about it. Is leading yourself, leading others, leading an organization, and then ultimately leading an enterprise. And we've actually built a lot of our things around it. And to your point, the idea of part of what's embedded in getting gear and the idea of driving strategy to results is this. As I mentioned at the top, I thought it was my experience, right? 30 some odd years of consulting with different organizations in different places, and everybody struggling at some level in getting the results that they wanted from their strategy, really being able to perform at the level that they wanted to perform at. When I started researching for the book, what I found was my experience was not unique. It's not like I was just stumbling and fumbling and bumbling upon those, few hundred organizations that were struggling. It turns out that an enormous number of organizations struggle. The research would be something like 75 to 90% of organizations fall short of getting the results they want from their strategy. So what I began to realize was, man, this is really a universal truth. And then to your point about as if you're leading an organization, you have to deliver the results that you expect. What we found, especially we knew this before, but then with COVID, it becomes almost an exclamation point. The idea that you're really managing, I call it 3 balance sheets. You're managing the balance sheet for the organization. You got to take care of it financially. You're managing the balance sheet for and with your team, and you're managing the balance sheet with the relationship that you've got with your customers. And if you don't perform well, if you don't deliver the results that you expect, you're not serving any one of those balance sheets well. Financially, you put your organization at risk. You can't create the environment where you can keep your team and keep people employed and keep them fully engaged in the organization. And you're certainly not going to perform well for your customers if you're struggling merely to survive. So I think it's really critical from a leadership perspective to think about what do we do to deliver the best results we possibly can so that we can preserve all 3 of those balance sheets.
Yeah, I definitely like that concept for sure, and works well, especially in the business organization. Those balance sheets concept. So let's talk a bit about more in depth about the book, so that the audience can get a taste of it, a flavor for what you're talking about in it. So, what are these 7 different gears that we talk about? And what really, how does one drive into the next as we go through them?
Sure, I'll go over them quickly, then we can figure out if you want to dive into.
We'll dive into a couple for sure.
Okay, great. I figured you might. So the 7. So we got this strategy to execution to results gap. 85% of organizations, let's say, come short, and they're leaving as much as 50% of the results that they want to get on the table, whether that's for their customers, how they deliver, whether that's for their team, the environment they create, and certainly financially for the organization. So they're leaving a lot on the table. So we looked at what are all of the things that connect strategy to results, and we identified these 7. And we've broken them into 2 categories. The first category, the first 3, are what I call the foundation or environmental gears. They have to happen across the whole organization. And then the last 4 are the performance gears. And those are the ones that really connect, regardless of whether you've got 2 people working in a garage, you're a solopreneur, working out of your own bedroom, or you're running a 50,000 person global organization. The performance gears connect performance from the top of the organization all the way to the frontline team members throughout the organization. So we'll take them in order. The first 3, the foundation gears. The first is what we call right. Having the right people in the right roles with the right capabilities to be able to execute on your strategy. Then gear 2 is aligning the architecture. And by architecture, we mean the systems, the structures, the processes, and the culture that it takes to create what we call organizational gravity. The system, structures, processes, culture pull people in the direction you want to go instead of having to try to cajole people. It just creates this kind of hidden, unseen force that gets people doing the right thing. Just think about it simply. If people do what they tend to get paid for, or they do what they think is the norm within the culture, or they do what others in the organization are getting promoted for, when promotions and compensation and culture align to the strategy, you get better performance. If they're not aligned for whatever reason, then trying to make change, trying to get the results you want you're like running in mud or molasses. Okay. Then the third gear is creating a culture of communications. So up, down, sideways, diagonally, everybody's connected. We can talk about the things we need to talk about. We deal with conflict. We can provide people the tough feedback. But generally, it's the communications that keep everybody on the same page of the playbook, understanding what's working, what's not working, what do we have to do to be better. So those are the foundation gears. And then the performance gears, there's a lot of logic to this. It's not like there's like this super secret here. It's things that we know, but we don't necessarily execute on these things well every day. So gear 4 is the idea of setting start-end time frame, result-oriented goals. So having people deliver specific results instead of just mindlessly going through activity day in and day out. Gear 5 is everybody has visible scorecards, so they know how they're performing relative to those goals. Then gear 6, there is activity. We call them the performance drivers, which are what are the things people do day in and day out, the decisions, the tasks, the behaviors that are aligned to hitting their goals. So you have to do stuff. We just don't want mindless activity. We want activity that's targeted to specific outcomes that you're trying to generate. And what we know is in almost all walks of life, almost anything anybody does, there are 2 or 3 things, critical behaviors that separate great performers from mediocre or even good performers. So identifying those critical performance drivers. And then gear 7 is the gear that it's the glue, as a friend of mine said, it's the glue that holds everything together. We call it follow up, follow through. And within follow up, follow through, there are 2 concepts. The first is the idea of generating learning. So if we're not on track with our goals, if we're not performing the way we want, why not? What's misaligned? What of the other 7 gears is misaligned? Or is it really, I'm just not performing and I need to perform better? Maybe I need different skills, different capabilities. But first generating learning, but then ultimately creating accountability for performance. Individuals and teams ultimately have to be accountable. And so if everything else is well aligned and you're still not getting performance, ultimately we have to create some level of accountability, or the accountability on the positive side. When we hit goals, when we accomplish what we want to accomplish, there need to be positive outcomes, positive consequences for that.
No, I really love 2 things. One was the transparency, the open scorecards, and 2, the whole accountability bit. And I guess my question for you on those is, you must get pushback on that, because especially on the transparent scorecards, because everyone's so guarded, like, oh, like my peers shouldn't know how I'm performing. That's between me and my supervisor. But I like it because it helps promote that healthy competition. So yesterday I was on a call with a former U.S. Navy SEAL commander, John McCaskill, who he was on the show, episode 142 2, Remembrance Day special. Great guy. And on this call, a different call I was on with him, he was talking about how in the Navy SEALs there's always healthy competition. There's always, every time they went to the range, they would take score just so you know how you were shooting. But it's like, oh, I'm going to have to shoot better than the guy next to me. To go for a run, it's like, I got to try to beat the guys to the end. And it's always just driving that performance, trying to get to the top of their game, their individual game. So collectively, they can be better. However, I feel like in the corporate world, it's like, no, you don't need to know how I'm doing. That's none of your business. So do you get a lot of pushback on that, or does it come with open arms?
I think it's kind of a combination of both. There is pushback, right? Because sometimes we use scorecards to punish people, to beat people up. And when you do that, people look, I don't want you to keep score on me if it means I'm going to randomly get beaten up for it. On the other hand, and here's the analogy that we use in the book. If you're driving down the street and you got kids playing soccer or basketball on two fields or 2 courts right next to each other, and on let's say a basketball, on one court the kids are keeping score, and on the other court the kids they're just playing for fun and they're not keeping score at all. Now, kids on both courts are probably having fun, but from 100 yards away, how quickly would you be able to tell which court people are keeping score on and which ones they're not keeping score on? And for most people, that answer is less than about 3 seconds. And why is that? Well, when we keep score, we tend to play more intensively. We tend to give each other better feedback. We tend to coordinate our activities better if we're all oriented on the goal. Now, that might be, Scott, you're the best scorer on the team. And so we all make sure you get the ball as often as you possibly can because we want to win the game and keep the court, on who's got next, right? And so keeping score creates a level of intensity. People want to win. They want to be their best. On the other hand, if we're just going to randomly beat them up for keeping score, then in that case, I don't want you to keep score because I don't want, to beat me up over it. I led a turnaround on a resort. We tell this story in the book, and it's what happens when scorecards go bad. And I was leading the turnaround on this resort. We had 11 food and beverage operations, and one of the things we started doing with the leaders was once a week we'd sit down and we'd have a profit and loss review. And those 11 food and beverage operations ranged from nacho stands at a beach that we had to what was supposed to be a 5-star white tablecloth fine dining experience. And it was sit down the first month and we're looking at the profit and loss statements for each of these 11 operations. And I was struck by the fact that in every one of those operations, the percentage food cost to revenue was exactly the same. It was 37%, and it didn't matter. So our food costs were 37% of our revenue, regardless of whether it was the nacho stand or the fine dining restaurant. Now, I didn't have a huge amount of food and beverage experience, but I'm looking at that and I'm like, what are the odds, right? What are the odds that could happen? And it's the first month and I'm kind of the rookie and I'm trying to get the team re-engaged. And so I didn't completely lose my mind the first month. And so we had a conversation about it and everybody's got, and they're kind of checking their shoes to see how well shined they are because they don't want to look me in the eye, right? I'm like, okay, look, I'm going to let this go. But next month when we come back, I'm going to expect these numbers to be different. So we get back together the next month and they were better. They took it from 37% to 36%. But again, it was 36% in the nacho stand. It was 36% at the coffee shop attached to the golf course. It was 36% in our fine dining restaurant, 36% across the board. I'm like, okay. And by then I got myself educated and I knew that the food cost in the nacho stand was probably supposed to be 20%. And in the fine dining restaurant, it was probably supposed to be, 40% or 45%. It costs a lot to put a steak on a table. You make a lot of money off it, but it costs a lot to put that steak on the table. So I knew there was supposed to be a difference. And by then I knew kind of what the difference was supposed to be. So I looked at him and I said, hey, what's going on? Now nobody is looking up. Everybody's checking their shoes to see how well shined they were. Nobody wants to even talk. So I just stood up, went over, locked the door, symbolically stupid because they could all stand up and unlock the door and leave. I said, like, I'm not leaving here until we understand what's going on. And so finally, after 2 or 3 minutes of really uncomfortable silence, one of the leaders broke and said, okay, yeah, well, you're right. We're manipulating the numbers. Why are you manipulating the numbers? And they said, well, because under the old leadership, if you were different, even if it was legitimate and explainable, if your numbers were worse than somebody else's numbers, you just got beat up. You got thrashed. And then they gave me multiple examples of the previous leadership team just beating these people psychologically. Well, it's no wonder they were doing what they were doing, right? I wouldn't want a visible scorecard under those circumstances if you're just going to beat me up. Well, it was really interesting, though, Scott. We plumbed deeper into it. And I was fascinated when they told me, I said, so how do you all do this? Well, the only way to manipulate the numbers is to move inventory around at the end of the month. So what they were doing was they were at like 10 o'clock on the last day of the month, 10 p.m. They're all getting their numbers together. They got on a conference call. They talked about what their numbers were. They figured out who was higher, who was lower. And then they spent the next 2 hours or 3 hours moving inventory around the resort from place to place to place, recalculating their numbers and making sure that their P&Ls were going to foot out to the same. And so I learned a lot about the team. First of all, they were taking care of each other. Secondly, they really understood their business extremely well because they were able to manipulate the numbers that way. They were awesome. They had just been in a really horrible environment. So to your point, are people going to shirk from a visible scorecard? They might, if they're in an environment where they're going to get beat up for it, instead of going kind of hopping over to the accountability side, to the Gear 7 side. Instead of generating learning, let's understand what the difference in the numbers is and then use it to be better versus beating the heck out of people.
It's tough being alone as a leader. You're often in situations where you're not sure where to go. You're not sure what's the best decision. Yet, as Colin Powell once said, it's lonely at the top. And reality is, it takes time. Sure, you can read books and listen to podcasts such as this one, but nothing beats experience. But who has time for experience when you're at a situation right now that requires experience to lead yourself, your team, your organization through? That's where coaching comes in. You see, coaching enables you to unlock the experience in others. Right here, right now, you have 20 years of military service plus 150 plus episodes of interviews and topics and research sitting at your disposal. So what are you waiting for? Are you ready to level up your game, become that leader that you know you're meant to be? Are you ready to go to the next level? If so, drop me a line, scott@movingforwardleadership.com, or swing by the website and book a discovery call through movingforwardleadership.com/book. And let's get you moving in the right direction, leading better, leading more effectively today, right here, right now. Starting off with leading yourself. And then let's focus on how you can build your high-performing team to drive your organization's output higher, faster, harder today. Not next week, not next month, but today. All right, folks, that's it. Now let's get back to the show. That's an incredible story. I like to refer to it as ostriching. You know, the old cartoons where you take the ostrich, takes its head and dumps it into the sand. Because the reality is you don't actually have any idea of how your business is operating when you get things like that happening. But you're absolutely right. What an incredible team. Holy cow. They were taking care of themselves by kind of defaulting to the leadership, I like to refer to people like in this scenario, the boss's stance and not, trying to take each other out and go cutthroat.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just a matter of managing expectations and having an understanding. It's like, okay, nachos, we should, the goal is 20%. All right. How close are you to 20%? And fine dining, 40%, as you said. Okay. How close are you? Over? Are you under? Why? But instead it's like, no, I'm just going to destroy you. Right. So I hate that mentality. That's one of the reasons why the podcast exists. The tagline for the show is lead, don't boss. And that's unfortunately, they were getting the latter of that one, but still that's a great story. And I love it. I love so many aspects of it. And I'm sure that they're much better today than what they were back then.
It was really interesting how quickly, once we got the numbers out into the light, how quickly we got better at what we were trying to do, right? As soon as we could start having real conversations about what's really going on here, how do we get better? When you take all that energy that was going in, first of all, that was avoiding the thrashings, but then was going into like moving inventory around and trying to think about how do we keep ourselves from getting beat up. As soon as you start channeling that energy and, hey, let's go perform better, it was magical how quickly All those units started to perform better.
Absolutely. Oh, I can only imagine. Once you take your head out of the sand, you actually have a clear picture of what's actually going on. It's so easy to turn things around. Now, my following question is, obviously, you got the 7 gears. I'd love to go into all of them, but we'd probably do a day-long podcast. What I'm interested to know, though, with your experience as a consultant and your experience applying this theory, this framework to the work that you do you find that there's one or two common gears where organizations are like, that's where they're really grinding, as in not working well? Is there a common area, or is there little bits sprinkled right through the whole process?
They're a little bit sprinkled right through. The one that we always advocate people start with is gear 4, setting result-oriented goals. And here's why. We always start, when we're working with organizations on these kind of things, we always start with a really simple exercise. We ask performers, frontline team members, or anybody at any level of the organization to write down what they believe their top 5 goals are. And then we ask their bosses, their leaders, to write down what they think those performers' top 5 goals are. And we've done this with frontline teams. We've done it with executive teams. The results are almost always the same over literally probably 20,000 repetitions now over 30 years. What we find is that on average, so now we've got the performers at any level of the organization writing down their top 5 goals. We've got their bosses writing down what they think the top 5 goals of are those performers, the next level down. Theoretically, we've got 2 lists that should match 5 on 5. On average, what we find is it's about 2 out of the 5 actually match, which means maybe 40% of the time people are performing on what their bosses think is important. 60% of the time it's a crapshoot. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. So it's a great place to start, because the first thing we got to do is we got to get alignment on those 5 things. What are they? And then making sure that whether I'm in sales or I'm in customer service or I'm in production or wherever I might be in the organization, that my goals are aligned to the strategy of the organization. So that's a great place to start, because we know that that's often broken. And then from there, we can start talking about, okay, what other gear is most getting in the way of somebody being able to achieve the goals that they ought to have.
I can totally see how that would happen. It's that whole communication thing, right? That leadership doesn't necessarily get right all the time, or does that they don't necessarily follow up. Often I find with some of my clients that I've worked with, it's like, oh, one and done. Like, oh, I let them know what it is. Like, no. It's not a one and done thing. This is not a precision strike. This is a constant bombardment of what the vision is, what the goal is, or what the mission are. And I'm like, why? I'm like, because people forget. People, perceive things differently at different times. There's so many factors to come to play. You can't just one and done this and expect to have the same results. And then, of course, it's like, if it's a very layered organization, you as the leader speaking to your management team, and they go turn around and talk to their people, like, how does the telephone game play out?
Right.
And you as a leader, you need to get away and get out and check with the ground level folks to make sure that the message that you said has been clearly passed to the floor. And I can tell you from experience, it does not happen whatsoever. And that's not done maliciously. It's just done due to human nature. So I commanded a squadron of 200 military members, and we're divided through 3 different troops: maintenance, supply, and transport. And I would walk around every Friday. I would pick one of the troops, and we were spread across 9 different buildings. So myself and my right-hand man, my sergeant major, would get it. Every Friday morning, we'd leave our office. We'd go walk around through a couple of the buildings and just talk to the people, see how they're doing, and get a feel of, okay, are the messages getting through? And I can tell you, a lot of the times, no. But it's just a matter of, continuously, saying what the goals are and what the vision is and what the mission is to get people to understand and really get it driven in.
I couldn't agree more. It's almost like you wrote the culture of communications chapter. Um, a couple things you talked about. I told him once. Do I really have to tell him again? One of the subparts of creating a culture of communications, we call it communicate, communicate, communicate. As I wrote it, I actually at the end of that section of the book, I talk about the fact that maybe I should have actually called that chapter communicate, 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 because that's so common. I told them once, I don't understand why they don't get it. Well, look, they just don't get it. Okay. You got to tell them 7, 8, 10 times or more times. You got to check for understanding. You got to get them to parrot it back in their language to make sure that, right. And so all those kind of things. We talk about in the book, first of all, we talk about, in my experience over 30 some odd years, the idea of a place where communications is awesome, is excellent, and everybody's bubbling about it. We call those unicorns, because they are, in spite of the hundreds, thousands of organizations that we've worked with, we've crossed paths with the unicorn 2 or 3 times, 5 times maybe. Now, you'll see it in subparts of organizations, but across large organizations, it's just incredibly rare to find a place where we communicate up, down, sideways, diagonally all the time, because it is hard. There's just this inertia that keeps information from penetrating. And then I love the story about you and your sergeant major, because it's a great example of what we talk about in the book of practicing 2 up, 2 down communications. What do we mean by that? Yeah, communicating 2 levels up and 2 levels down, because that way, as you're out walking around, you're finding out what messages were penetrating down to your troops, right? And they're able to communicate with you directly. You're finding out what's penetrating back to you. And again, to your point, nobody intentionally, rarely, there are rare cases, but most of the time, we're not intentionally withholding information. We're not intentionally filtering it. We just do. It's the inertia of the organization. It's the marshmallow layer in the organization. So when you go practice 2 up, 2 down communications like you did, you kind of punch through that marshmallow layer.
Yo, absolutely. Sometimes you do find things that that were wrongly done, as I did once, but we won't necessarily go into that story today. It didn't end well for a certain individual, but no, this has been great, Sean. I've thoroughly, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate the book and everything that we discussed today. Before we wrap up, I do got a couple last questions for you. A question I asked all of the guests here, moving forward leadership, and that is, according to you, Sean Ryan, what makes a great leader?
This is going to be a different answer than what you probably get. The best leaders I've seen, we talk about it in terms of thinking, action, outcomes. As leaders, we take action all the time. The best leaders we've seen are the ones who can challenge their own fundamental assumptions, beliefs, perceptions, and hold them up for examination and decide, is my thinking, my assumptions about the people that work for me, the situation I'm in, my beliefs, are they helping me engage my team to deliver the results that I need to deliver as a leader, or are they getting in the way? And so the greatest leaders can self-examine and can challenge their own thinking and then change it to generate better outcomes for themselves, their teams, their organizations.
That's awesome. Continuous self-improvement, right? That's the name of the game. Final question is, how can people find you? How can they follow you? Feel free to give yourself a shameless plug. It's all about you right now.
Great. The easiest way to get to us is our website, wwici.com. Again, it's wwici.com. Go to the website. You get the opportunity to become a gearhead. You can get access to the book and the gearhead environment that we've set up, and come join us and help become part of the community to help organizations and individuals perform better.
That's awesome. As a auto enthusiast, I don't know if I would consider you a gearhead, because I consider me a gearhead, but still, regardless, for the listener out there, the links are all in the show notes. Sean's website, where you can grab the book, all of his social media profiles. So just go to movingforwardleadership.com/154, and they're all there. Sean, again, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule, man, to talk to me, but most importantly, the audience on such a great topic, for sure.
Scott, it's been a treat. Much enjoyed it.
And that's it for this episode today. And if you listened to it to this far, wow, you're a super fan. Thanks for listening. But before we close out, I got two things I wanted to let you know. First being, did you know that it's easy to share the Moving Forward Leadership podcast? You see, regardless of what app you're using to listen to this show right now, whether that's on your phone, be it Android or iOS, or it's on your computer through the website, there's a share button right there. So why don't you take a moment and share this episode? That's all I ask. Don't even care about a rating and review anymore, but rather I would you to share it with someone, because you know what? They'd probably get something out of this episode as well. And finally, if you really enjoy the podcast and you feel like throwing me a bone, well, I'm a borderline coffeeaholic, so how about you just buy me a cup of coffee? And you can easily do that with going to movingforwardleadership.com/coffee. And feel free to throw me $1 or $2 for a cup of coffee. I don't need anything fancy. Good old Tim Hortons here in Canada works just fine for me. But as always, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening. It's an honor to serve you day in, day out with this podcast. And as always, lead, don't boss. Thanks, and take care.